Well, we're starting up here on Evolution Hour 21. Here's my Ways Evolution Hour logo bit that SciStrike put together that would have had music for it, but we're screw-ups on figuring out how to get YouTube to do some sort of things, and I'm really a novice at this, so I plead guilty. This is our 21st Evolution Hour, and this is the first one that was actually suggested by a subject from people on the creationism land. Somebody on Twitter asked me, show evidence for speciation, ha ha. Ha part in there, but it was an obvious notion that, wait, gee whiz, he couldn't possibly know about any of that stuff. And I said, oh, I'm happy to do that. That's an excellent subject. I'd actually done an earlier show, if you remember, on the speciation issue and why anti-evolutionists have such a terrible problem with it. But I thought we might as well hit in on the big time here. And I put up a variety of sources that anybody can follow up on. They're all open access. I'll be alluding to them during the course of the study, but the first order of business is to explain why creationists think there's a problem here and what are the conceptual difficulties for them. There are two main areas where creationists glitch up. One is the idea that if you show them examples of speciation, they'll go, well, it's just the same kind. It's still a fish. It's still a butterfly. It's still a mouse. Nothing has really changed. Problem. The second is that they think of things needing to be half-formed. Where are all of the failed experiments in the evolutionary process of evolution is true? Those involve two big fundamental mistakes. One, that the idea that populations aren't always going to look full of individuals that are fully formed. You don't have a stub of a wing suddenly sprouting out of an animal. That's not how evolution works. It builds on microevolutionary gradual elements. That's true that we can see in the development of birds. It's true in the reptile-mammal transition. It's true in any area where we've got a lot of fun stuff going on, where you have enough data set. The other is their difficulty in taking that notion of what a speciation process means and then applying it to other stuff, applying it to the past. And this is literally a 100% failure rate. All anti-evolutionists, from Michael Denton over in the intelligent design side to somebody like Duane Gish, the late Duane Gish over in the creationism side, all suffer from that at the upper level of their own apologetics, let alone what's going on down below. Now, I pulled up a little chart. Let me see if I can get this up in the old screen sharing thing that illustrates kind of what I have in mind here. Let's get that out of the way. Whoop. This is the cutest graphic, and there's another version that I've seen elsewhere, which is a set of words that start out red at one end and end up blue on the other, but the same process is involved. You can see a spectrum. Imagine any slice along that spectrum vertically from top to bottom as what you would be seeing in any time slice. Imagine that you are at now, and imagine that's on the right side of the screen. So you're talking about a speciation thing of red. And if you were to look at the details, what you would be seeing would be something along a spectrum of individual change. But within a population, it's always going to look like a vertical line. In other words, there's all going to be a lot of stuff that looks virtually the same. You'll notice that at no point is there a section of the screen that is half blue and half red. It's progressively less blue on one side and progressively more reddish along the other on a series of tiny incremental changes. That's what happens if you uptake a speciation process and see what's going on over a long period of time. Once you get at that conceptualization, then you can see all the phenomenon going on. But creationists, I think, literally can't get past that. They cannot conceptualize that basic notion. So what I did was pull up a variety of papers where I would be looking at things. I brought up the ring species concept first, which is pretty straightforward to conceptualize. There's recently been some papers and discussion that Jerry Coyne has mentioned on evolution is true, which I won't link to, but if anybody wants to know sources, they can ask me about it, where technically speaking, a ring has to be very precise in order to be recognized. If you imagine the herring gull is the classic example. Just imagine you're looking down on the Arctic Ocean and you're seeing the ring of land that starts with Siberia and goes all the way around to the Americas and Alaska at the other end. So Alaska and Siberia are across each other on the Bering Strait. There are herring gulls that live all around that Arctic Ocean. And if you start with the ones in Siberia and call them A, and their neighbors next door is B, and their neighbors next door are C, and D and E and F, all the way around until you got like an H over in Alaska. A will interbreed with B, B will interbreed with C, C will interbreed with D, and so forth around the line. But if you try to interbreed A, and it won't interbreed. Now, all you have to do is imagine what would happen if all of the intermediates disappeared because of climate change or geographical isolation, and bingo, you got two species where you used to have one. That builds on the notion of the speciation process, how it involves interbreedability. Not merely can it, but will it in nature. And so hybrids, half of all bird species, apparently, duck species, apparently will interbreed, hybridize between species. They don't always do it in the wild. I put a link up to a paper by Michael Torelli, which goes into an awful lot of the nitty-gritty details. Jerry Coyne, I think, is one of the co-authors on it as well. And they go into all the buzzwords, prezygotic isolation mechanisms, and allopatric versus sympatric speciation. Sympatric is kind of a vertical in a line, A turns into B and A is gone. Whereas allopatric speciation, the kind that Ernst Mayr was promulgating and is the main model that's used today, is geographic isolation, where an A starts varying more and more broadly and geographically more and more broad areas, and it covers a bigger and bigger distance like those ring species things do, until the point where you've got an A and a B both operating simultaneously, and then they achieve geographic isolation, and now you got A and B. A doesn't disappear under that model necessarily. And so now you got two species where you had number one. Now, we know what's going on in speciation in living animals because there's been a ton of stuff done on it. And I can guarantee you, because I look at this in the TIP project, anti-evolutionists don't pay diddly squat attention to any of it. I mean that literally. That they're only sampling tiny little blips of the technical literature. I put up some examples that were relevant on fruit flies, good old Drosophila. There's been a lot of detail work on there. First of all, they live not a long time, so you can breed them really fast. You can do them in the laboratory. You can observe them in the wild. I think 70% of all the fruit fly species are in Hawaii. That's another issue of biogeography. There's fun stuff there. But there's been a lot of technical work looking at this zygotic mechanism for isolation of populations in fruit flies, where they're at the genetic level. They can see what individual factors are affecting the ability of one section of the population to interbreed with another or not in the process of closing off that doorway to generate an actual separate species. And so there's some old work by Anthony Greenberg, old 2006. That's old in science terms, but that's already well down the line of work in that area. And then Michael Gillet, his 2012 work, which continues on that. And there's way more stuff, but this will give you a sampling, and it's all open access. Then there's another paper I put up from David Mark from 2016 on the stickleback fish. Those are fast breeder things where you can find instances of things where you can get geographic isolation fairly rapidly. Although, here's where the creationists pop in with their mythologies. They'll go, oh, but it's still a fish. Of course it's still a fish. The question is, what can happen in the long term? There you got to look at the fossil record. So, let me stop a moment to look over what's going on in the conversation area. It looks like we've got some people talking about dogs meowed. Nim brings up a very classic trope. The creationist wants to see dogs turning into cats, or cats turning into dogs, or monkeys turning into people right there in front of you. And if they can't see that, then they think you can't form evolution. But remember the chart that I put up, the illustration from the blue to the red, and try to imagine the complexity of a whole population of organisms, and then imagine that going on not for just a generation or two, but for thousands and thousands and thousands, or millions and millions and millions of years, and you get a different picture. Now, I found a wonderful paper. It's fairly old, 2001, but it covers an awful lot of the turf. Michael Benton and Paul Pearson, and I'm going to see if I can pull up an image from there so that you can see what the hell we're talking about. I plead guilty to the fact that I'm a clumsy oaf on the visual things. I know there's ways of doing this more efficiently, but I'm an old fart, and I'm amazed that I can do any of this stuff at all. But anyway, here's on their thing, and that you can download the whole PDF yourself. This is from a diatom, Rhizoselenia, from a few million years ago, and you can see the chart that shows the population back 3.4 million years, and you'll notice the error bars are indicating the range of its variation. And what's happening is that population is continuing along, and it continues along on the top. It stays within that range. So there you've got stasis. But along about 3.2, 3.3, 3.4 million years ago, you start seeing a range that is generating a new version that branches off a new population that becomes a new species. And we can literally catch that. Why? Because diatoms leave their little husks behind, their little shells, and they produce colossal numbers of them. Foraminifera are another one, and there was another paper that I put up from Pinchelli, Hull, and Richard Norris from 2009 on foraminifera that show exactly the same thing. Because you've got millions of years, or in this case, a colossal, from 3.4 down to 1.6 million years. You got 1.8 million years worth of little bodies raining down. You can track in great detail in a deposit that stuff. That doesn't usually happen with vertebrates for pretty obvious reasons, because they're much rarer for fossilization. So all you're getting are tiny little blips. Imagine if you were to see something that represented the critter at 3.4 million years ago, and then your next blip on the scope is something from 2.4. Well, from 2.4, you would see the little green blob down on the bottom and the hollow circle up on the top as both existing at the same time in the fossil. You would look like, wow, there's been an abrupt thing that's going on. Well, the speciation event took place hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Benton offers as a general ballpark that the average speciation time in forms of life is about 500,000 years. Well, that's way longer than the ability to look at for an individual scientist. Even if occasionally zygotic isolation can occur relatively rapidly, in an awful lot of cases, and in most cases of vertebrates particularly, it's slow as molasses. And if you have a speciation process that's even 50,000 years old to get from start to stop, it's going to be difficult to see in the fossil record if you're only getting a sampling of maybe every few million years in terms of a fossil. Remember what you would be seeing if you got in your time machine and went back to there. It would be a population of organisms that would be like one of the vertical slices on that blue to red sheet. And they would all look pretty much alike. They would show variation just like those little foraminifera and diatoms would do. And a creationist taken back in the time machine would see, well, they're just whatever it is. They're not changing any. Of course not, because you've got to look at it over that very, very long period of time. Now, young Earth creationists at least have the dodge that they can argue that, oh, well, there ain't a long amount of time. Everything is only 6,000 years old. The fossil record's only from 4,500 years ago in the flood. And so they have at least an honest leg to stand on in jumping off the gangplank into stupidity. But the intelligent designers and old Earth creationists don't have that dodge because they theoretically accept that time frame. So what is going on with all of that? Michael Denton, who I excoriate in Evolution Slam Dunk, which I'm still recommending everybody get. The author needs the money, and it's also a damn good book. On the reptile-mammal transition, Michael Denton is somebody at the top of the food chain in the intelligent design movement who theoretically accepts speciation, but he never applies it to anything. And so he can accept ring species, he can accept biogeographical speciation of the finches and all of that, but yet he thinks somehow or other they can't figure out the adaptive Darwinian scenario to account for the data, even though he doesn't dispute the data. Meanwhile, the evolutionists are going their busy little game to actually explain the data. Let me stop in and take a look over in the live feed conversation. Oh, Brian Stevens says, yes, his sand around where he lives is chock full of diatoms shells. They have all sorts of crazy, beautiful shapes. Yeah, they're very distinctive. And there's only beginning to do genetic work as to why they look the way they do. A lot of them live at very great depth. They're really difficult to grow in a lab. You just can't make an ocean-sized aquarium to work with the devils. And so I mentioned some of this in one of the tip postings on the foraminifera, where Casey Luskin was jumping off the the gangplank. That would be in tip 1.3. I'll put the little blip up here on that, which you can all find at www.tortugan.wordpress.com. And if you don't have that on your speed dial, what the hell's wrong? Anyway, tip 1.3 is on punctuated equilibrium and the stasis issue. And that should be tip 1.3. Cold fingers, cold, frustrated. I fumble up. Anyway, there's been relatively little genetic work on a lot of these things. There will be more in the future, of course, and I'll bet you a dollar to a hole in a donut that the evolutionary model will come out explaining stuff more, and anti-evolutionists won't pay any attention to it. Now, in addition to the Benton paper, which gives a general summary, Michael Benton is a really famous mammal paleontologist, and that's his major area, but he covers fossil in general, and has written a bunch of wonderful books and things, and I highly recommend him. He's a marvelous guy. He's a British fellow. I've had an exchange or two with him, hunting up information for the TIP project over the years. Anyway, I put in also some stuff from Richard Tedford from 2009 on carnivores and canines, the dog group that eventually produces the dogs, since we all like to talk about the dogs. And you've actually got transitional examples in there where that same gradation of variation, that kind of overlappy transitional zone that we're seeing with the diatoms and with the foraminifera, it is seen in the actual fossil record, and it's relatively recent, and we've got a fairly good fossil record on it. When the more examples you can get, the more you're likely to see these smoking guns. I also put up stuff on dinosaurs. Andrew Fark and Anthony Fiorello and Ronald Tchaikovsky's papers from 2011 and 2012 on Archelosaurus and the Pachyrhinosaurus. Boy, those are ones that your kids probably can pronounce easier than I can. Pachyrhinosauruses are cousins to the Triceratops. They have this weird rugose lump on the front of their head that may or may not be the root of a horn. It's very pesky and unusual. And Archelosaurus is exactly what you would expect an ancestor species to look like. And some paleontologists, in fact, argue that it is literally the ancestor species for the Pachyrhinosaurs, whereas others say, well, no, it's just really close cousin. At any rate, it's a really close cousin. And so the argument that a lot of creationists love is to say, well, Kent Hovind has trotted it out recently in some of his debates, still does. He says, well, you don't know that that animal bred. You don't know that it had any babies. There's no way to tell. And boy, this is a spectacular missing the point. If it is an adult form capable of breeding, there's nothing to preclude that it bred. And even if, and the odds are that the fossil that's literally preserved is unlikely to be the literal ancestor of those animals, but it is likely to be part of a population which is either part of that group or a close cousin to it. Do you think they didn't breed at all? When you look at a deposit like the Solnhofen in the Jurassic, where all the Archaeopteryx fossils are found, I think they found about 12 now, so forth, of which there are 2 separate species, by the way, identified. They can find the transitional branching between the standard Archaeopteryx and then apparently a variant that's deserving its own specialized species name. All of the Archaeopteryxes are from that one deposit. They're not known from anywhere else. Now, would a creationist argue that there were only 12 of them in existence? That God made only 12 Archaeopteryxes and every single one of them got preserved in the flood? Or an intelligent designer, would they have to say that there were only 12 Archaeopteryxes in all of history and none of them ever bred? They were all specifically designed on the spot and never did anything. They never laid an egg. Or is it more likely that what we're seeing is just like what we see in the real world, where those are representatives of a population of organisms that were egg layers, and they probably did, some of them did lay eggs, and there were eggs all over the place, and other Archaeopteryxes, others that didn't get preserved at the Solnhofen. That's the difference between a naturalistic view of the world that tries to apply what we can observe happening in the real world to what happened in the fossil record and to rebuild a map of time. And the fact that literally no anti-evolutionist ever gets within 100 miles of building their own map of time in their head on this, here's what we think happened, is at the core not only of their anti-evolutionism, but of this speciation issue. So we're 18 minutes down onto here. And I see we've got BJ Price. Yes, BJ Price. Lots of rough surfaces, the rugose features on the these oddball ceratopsids. Ceratopsids are a very broad-ranging group. I think I've mentioned them occasionally before because I'm a big dinosaur groupie, and I would have been a dinosaur groupie independent of going after creationism or not. I'm just interested in it on its own. And anybody who looks into that field can see the broad range. All of the major ceratopsids are originating in North America. They're developing from these little protoceratopsids that are much smaller animals but still have the little fringe collar that eventually becomes the big head shield. They also have the predentary bone that looks kind of like a parrot beak. They also have kind of a splayed leg bit. Their ancestors were bipedal, and in going quadrupedal, they still had kind of an odd stance that has been noted by a lot of paleontologists over the years. Now, the ancestor group, these protoceratopsids, actually were starting in Asia, and they moved across the land connections between North America that had formed, and it was in the North American branch that developed into the much bigger ceratopsids, probably because they were no longer facing the same ecological constraints that was limiting their size over in the land of Asia. Go farther back in time, and the ceratopsids ancestor forms involve these psittacosaurids that are look like a shrunk down version of a protoceratopsid, except they're bipedal. And they have the ones typically have 4 digits, although I think they've also found a 5-digit model. So there's another transitional form that's been popping up. The fossil genie just loves evolutionists. And they're the very first form that actually shows that predentary bone parrot beak shape. So that they're clearly a node in what eventually leads off in North America to a group that becomes one of the major herbivore groups, and also one of the major things that your tyrannosaurs would be running after for dinner, which over a period of what, 50, 60, 70 million years, I'd have to think through when the psittacosaurids were. I think they're early Cretaceous, and your ceratopsids are quite close to late Cretaceous. Anyway, the Beach prices, they don't even accept the evolution of their Bible. Yeah, that's a side issue, but yeah, it's no coincidence that people who have a difficulty paying attention to all the fossil details and creating a map of time that way have a problem dealing with the forensic details of how not merely their religion, but everybody else has the same problem. We don't have that with some religions that formed recently. So we can see the nitty-gritty details of Mormonism and how it originates because we've got independent records. So we know about what Joseph Smith was doing and stuff independent of what the church would be telling you later on. But all you have to imagine is what would happen if you have a church that has the ability to edit its data trail and burn heretics and eliminate any information that doesn't fit. Well, that's kind of a side issue from the speciation issue. Are there any specific questions, since I don't have anybody in-house in the show itself? I'll depend on questions relating to the speciation process, into how that relates to creationism, and any other examples that you might be intrigued with to discuss. I will say that on the reptile-mammal transition front, that if you have a clear sense of what speciation involves, and the kind of limitations and ranges that it can do and the speed with which it functions. When you look at all that reptile-mammal transition data, where you're starting out with a reptile-y thing at one end and going through the synapsids and into the therapsids and the advanced cynodonts and then into the mammals, that there's no point anywhere in that long 100 million years when you've got any big jumps going on. Even the ones where there's like 20 million year gaps, it's relatively minor shifts that are required incrementally in that blue to red spectrum that we would be seeing at the detail level. And so anti-evolutionists would have to explain why any of the connecting links don't follow the basic principles of what we can see in speciation. But since they never conceptualize the speciation and don't apply it to anywhere, they insulate their brain from it. Beach says, I have no questions, here to listen. Damn it, you mean I'm explaining everything so perfectly that everybody understands it? Well, okay. So part of the issue then when dealing with any creationist on this subject is to how to yank them off of their dogmatic pedestal and get them to interact with the data. Most of the time, just be aware of the fact that they won't know any of the data. That if you start rattling off actual taxa, as I just did here in the course of this show and showed you examples of stuff up on the screen, they won't have the foggiest idea what any of that stuff is. They'll have never seen any of that in their creationist literature. No preacher will have ever discussed it. None of the lecturers at intelligent design shows will have ever come into any of that material. They will have not a clue. So you'll have to remember, you need to prep them conceptually to understand that part. And the major part is, and this is what differentiates Tortukans from non-Tortukans, is that a non-Tortukan who was raised in a creationist framework, if you start prodding them with information and the desire to look up the information, they actually will do that. In which case, there's hope that they may actually eventually change their mind. If they plead, oh, show me the evidence, but they don't actually engage that evidence after you show it to them. And that happens again and again and again. I've seen that on Twitter and in other contexts where somebody says, show me the evidence for things. Well, here's the evidence. And then they ignore it. And then a few days later or a week later, they'll say, show me the evidence. Again, they'll ask the same rhetorical question. And you wonder how many times they've asked that same rhetorical question and how many people have they brushed aside and how many times have they not followed through. And when you do that enough, then you're into bearing false witness category or misrepresentation, because they're asking a question that they've been answered on. They just don't like the answer and they're not going to think about it. Oh, Dustin Whitaker just logged in what evidence exists that the world is 100 million years? We'll do better than that, 4.5 billion. What's interesting about the formation of the geologic system is that it took place quite a while ago. And although it got refined by radiometric dating in the 20th century, it got the main outlines before that. I cover this a bit in the Dinomania chapter. Another thing that I'm saying, go look at my crap. I got it online. You can download it for free. That's chapter 3 of the old tip, and that's at www.tortugan.wordpress.com. My old little fingers here. Got to type out, make sure I don't have a typo again. I should have this all on cut and paste, but I improvise. Where I go into the context of stuff. If you look at geology books, for example, from 1900 all the way down into the modern era, and look at when they're dating stuff, you can see that over the course of the 19th century, they kind of worked out that the Cambrian must have been about 500 million years ago, thereabouts. And the other periods fall into, the dinosaur period is much more recent and so forth. And they got the dates ballpark pretty good. There was a time when they started pushing it back even farther, and you find some older books from the 40s and 50s that were thinking maybe the Cambrian went all the way back to 600 million years ago. And I think my old 1958 World Book Encyclopedia pushed it back that far. But then they started doing the radiometric dating. And what it did, two big things. It calibrated the other eras much more precisely. And they realized that all that part before the Cambrian that didn't have fossils that you could see without a microscope was way longer than they thought. And instead of maybe being a couple billion years, it turned out to be 4 billion years back to the age of the Earth. And that came as quite a surprise for them. Wow. It also telescoped out the land of bacteria. And you realize how slow the evolutionary process was until you start developing signs of multicellularity about 1 billion years ago. And you have a big burp in between, which is the formation of cyanobacteria and the things that eventually lead off into the chloroplast of plant cells. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on there, which has been discovered, an awful lot of which only within my lifetime. But the thing is, if you look at all the age ranges for the Cambrian, it turns out, our modern estimate's only about 10% different from what they came up with back in the 19th century. So they did a pretty damn good job. They were looking at how fast rocks erode. I mentioned Sicker Point, S-I-C-C-A-R, and very few creationists bother to play around with that, and if they do, they misrepresent it. And Stephen says, Dustin Whitaker, I can answer that with one word, geology, or geology, if you were being German about it. But the main thing is yeah, you had a lot of scientists, and this is certainly no conventional creation evolution issue. Sedgwick, Adam Sedgwick, who was a cleric and the guy that taught Darwin a lot of his geology at college, they disagreed completely on the evolution issue. Sedgwick was an anti-evolutionist to his dying day. But nevertheless, it was impossible to pay attention to the whole data stream as of 1830 and see the Earth as really, really young. It just didn't fit. If you looked at Sicker Point, if you looked at other geological deposits, they were certainly pushing it into the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of years. And so gradually, bit by bit, they looked at the kinds of things they were seeing as turnover index fossils and the like, that there was a lot of life changes. One of the reasons why catastrophism remained popular way down into the 19th century was that it looked, at least at first glance, like you had these sudden obliterations. And even today, we see those as reflecting the mass extinction zones, where there's a big turnover of life between what you see in the Cretaceous period, when the dinosaurs and things of Mesozoic were running the show, and then afterwards dinosaurs check out and you have mammals. But when you look at the detailed paleontology, something stands out about all of those that they didn't know as well back in the 19th century, but we have no excuse for not saying now, is that everything that made it through the extinction and leads to the stuff that happens later existed before the extinction. Mammals didn't pop out of the middle of nowhere. They weren't materializing at the tail end of things. No, they had a long windup. In fact, longer than the dinosaurs, as evolution slam dunk goes into. That the mammals are the coming out of the group in the Permian period, and they're actually getting to be pretty full-blown mammally in the sense that the eutherians, the placentals, and all that are pretty much diversified around the same time that dinosaurs are taking over the planet. And indeed, some groups, I've mentioned this several times, and it's fascinating because the fossils haven't been able to resolve it because they're really hard to fossilize, but bats. Bat fossils are showing up about 10 million years after the extinction of the dinosaurs, but all the genetic studies suggest they probably developed before the mass extinction. And maybe someday the fossil genie will give us some bat fossils that actually belong to the Cretaceous, in which case I'll go, ha ha, that will have vindicated the biology. Dustin Whitaker says, just learned the term radiometric dating, going to look into that. Thank you. Well, yeah, you're welcome. There's a huge amount of information that you can look into on this subject. Although you can start with Wikipedia or Google, don't stop there. Make sure of reading widely. If you really want to get into contact sport, read creationists on radiometric dating and then look up their sources. I know by direct inspection how incredibly evasive creationists can be on this subject. I know Andrew Snelling flat out misrepresented the stuff on diamonds, where he suppressed all the information in it that contradicted his argument as to why a diamond could give you a reading of 80 or 90,000 years old, and it's perfectly natural and perfectly expected. Beach Price said we did walk with dinosaurs, just very small, hairy, and cute. Yeah, the ancestor of the primates would have been knocking around back in the dinosaur period, because the placental mammals had already started to develop by the Mesozoic. And they remain small players most of the time, although it's a sign of things to come that you start seeing bigger mammals appearing, badger sizes, if memory serves me, that are going around presumably eating dinosaur eggs. That part of the factor is that mammals and their ancestors had begun to dominate a niche that dinosaurs didn't really do much in, and that's the night, nocturnal. And even today in birds, other than owls, birds aren't nocturnal. They slumber. They stay through the night and then wake up if something happens to them, but then they get up and do all their shit in the day, and they got superb day vision. They can see into ultraviolet light, which is one of the reasons why some of the feather forms that you discovered that look bland to our vision have really bright reflective spots in ultraviolet light, so it stands out like a sore thumb for a bird, and the bird's going, hey baby, ooh, 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 and part of their sexual display systems. We can presume some of that was probably going on with dinosaurs, because they're coming, that theropod group, there's some evidence that there were like mating dances that some of the theropods may have done. We know that an awful lot of them had feathers, and a lot of them may have been for sexual displays and not for thermal regulation, and certainly not for flight in the case of the non-flying ones. Dustin Wicker says, I'm definitely biased and a creationist, but I appreciate truth and evidence. Well, Dustin, it's a matter that I'm not telling you to abandon your beliefs unless you have evidence, and not to have beliefs unless you have evidence. So what you need to do is set up a universal standard and apply it universally, that you look to see, first of all, does your source give evidence for what they claim? If they don't offer sources at the end, I don't care if they're a creationist or an evolutionist, you go, yeah, that's pretty thin. So they should be able to document their stuff. If they document their stuff, are they documenting it with secondary sources, somebody telling them something, another creationist? That's dicey. If they're operating with primary sources and technical literature, look up the source, read about it. And this is the hardest part, is how do you know if your source is not telling you all the facts? That's the most difficult, and that's where you got to read widely. Because how do you know that they're not mentioning B when they don't mention B? You'd have to know B existed, and so you'd have to read outside that box. I can tell good scholars from bad scholars, and there's actually only one I've ever seen in the anti-evolution biz who falls in the, actually he's a careful scholar type, and that's Todd Wood. He's a young earth creationist. He's in the baraminology group, and he freely acknowledges, yes, there's evidence for evolution. Evolution is not a theory in crisis. There's actually lots of evidence for it, but I refuse to believe it because he is doctrinally committed to the faith of young earth creationism. And I don't know how long he can keep juggling those balls in the air without him finally going, you know, it doesn't explain the data. And he may have a crisis of faith at some point and jump ship. I don't know. But I do know that when you look at the rules of sound scholarship, and how you're supposed to play fair with your sources. You don't quote out of context. You don't cherry pick. You play fair. If you have contrary information, you mention it that it's coming from your own sources. I know that monotonously, creationists and anti-evolutionists in general, ideas do exactly the same thing. Step over evidence relentlessly, and they misrepresent sources relentlessly. I have no respect whatsoever for Duane Gish as a scholar. He's ingeniously gymnastic as a pseudo-scholar. I admire and marvel at the skill he has of ferreting through to pick out just the little bit that will look like what he wants to be true if you take off all the other parts. But the moment you look at all the other parts, you see the trick he's doing. So I can't respect that. And I in fact emailed him just before he died, where I was telling him how little I respected him. And when some creationist complained to me that, well, you won't tell him to his face. And I said, yes, I will. Give me his email address, and I'll be happy to do so. I'm willing to stand and fall on this, and I have no problem with anybody challenging me to offer evidence for my position. Needless to say, I've got a pile of it. If you look at TIP, I recommend nobody try to print my bibliography because it's 2,500 pages long. So I've got a pretty good style of things. I've got over 20,000 technical sources in there. And I make it a part of my work to do that aspect. Matter of fact, while we're in the doing the work part, I will put in my allusion to the funding issue. Let me see whether I've got my file still up in here. And there we go. There's my people on Patreon. Stephen and John and Dyer and Eat and Mona and Jen and Jody and Staggles and Totes and Paul. And I do want to thank you all for helping there. I can certainly use way more people at Patreon. I put the website up of the main TIP website where I've got links to everything, including all of my books. And then I've got the listing there you can see for the Patreon and also the GoFundMe. GoFundMe is way faster than Patreon on time, and you can do $5 there easy. Well, you can do $5 at Patreon too. I'm hoping Patreon can work out to ones who are able to do sustaining pledge, where they'll say, okay, I can do $5 a month, and we'll do that continuously, so that if you've got enough people doing that, it's relatively easy to do, and that's where the crowdfunding comes in. As yet, I'm not at crowd. I'm yet at very low level thing at the moment, but here's the information for you to look at, and I put the links up on the website. YouTube has now shifted their little trick, allow putting links up to websites, I guess, unless you go into a monetized form and all that. So I had to give up putting the links in, and SciStrike had a conniption fit on that, and I don't disagree. So I'll have to be putting manually the linkages into there and hope people pay attention to all of that. Hint, hint. Anyway, Dustin says, sorry if you've covered this already, but is it true that we do have tangible evidence that mammals haven't always been mammals? Oh, yes. And I will plug my book, Evolution Slam Dunk. And you can find that in at Amazon.com. It's available in all different ebook formats. Christine Janis, whose birthday was today. I just wished her a happy birthday. She had found out about my work years ago. She had bought the book on her own and was revising her own new mammal book on the basis of it. She's also contributed to the GoFundMe, so hint, hint on that point. She had found information in my book that she didn't know about in her own field. And you can read her review up there on Amazon, where she calls it an incredible tour de force. So back patting, whoops, there goes my microphone. I'm very proud of what I've done with Slam Dunk. What I did in that, Dustin, was, first of all, I was pissed off at how little the reptile-mammal transition was known in the creation-evolution debate. This is spectacular. This literally is what converted me into an evolutionist. I was an evolution skeptic coming out of high school and into college for years, and it really wasn't until the 1980s when I found out about the reptile-mammal transition and the biological data that I hadn't learned about earlier because I'd been reading too many anti-evolutionists that really changed my mind on that. And what you have, I'll give you the little short form on that. About 250 million years ago and earlier, you have a group of animals called the synapsids that have one skull opening. That's where the name synapsid comes from. The rivals in the reptile gang were the diapsids, 2 skull holes, die for 2. And those are the groups. The diapsids go off into modern reptiles. They produce the archosaurs that make crocodiles and dinosaurs and birds. So those are all in that diapsid lineage. But they were not major players at the time that the synapsids were going on. If you're familiar with Dimetrodon, the classic finback critter with the boop, boop, that comes in the little dinosaur sets and pops up as, you know, in the old Irwin Allen Lost World, or in Journey to the Center of the Earth, the old one with James Mason, where they'll stick a fin on the back of a Gila monster and call it a Dimetrodon. Those are actually synapsids, not diapsids. They're on our mammal evolution line. And the synapsid reptiles were the dominant group all through the Permian period up until the mass extinction. Only one little order. By that time, they were developing more and more into what we would now start seeing as the precursors to mammals. And in fact, I discuss it in Slam Dunk in some detail that in the 19th century, they started finding, they wondered where mammals came from. You have to remember, this is another example why the reptile-mammal transition is so spectacular, is you can use your own body as an indication of it. Let me pull my microphone aside because I'm going to be touching my stupid jaw here too much and it's going to clunk. Everybody's seen a Halloween skull, and you've got this great big dentary bone, and you've got the little coronoid processes that stick up from the ends, and you've got the zygomatic arch, our cheekbones. That's really standard mammal stuff. And that's something really unusual about it. Fish, amphibians, and reptiles all have a dentary bone, no problem. And they've got a bunch of other little bones next to them. And it's the articular bone at the far end that's the one that actually hinges with the quadrate bone that's up in the skull. Mammals don't do that. Mammals have one gigantic dentary bone, no other bones in the jaw. And they have the muscle attachments to the squamosal bone up in the skull, not the quadrate. Well, where the hell is the articulate and the quadrate? Well, we still have them. They're in our middle ear. And we know this literally since the 1830s because biologists, I've forgotten his name, I mentioned it in Slam Dunk and various other contexts, can't think of his name right off the bat, but he was the one that first noticed in mammal embryology that we start out with all of the bones that are familiar from the amphibians and the reptiles and the fish, with the same jaw hinge. And then as the cartilage forms and forms and the dentary bone grows and grows and grows and grows, once it bumps into the squamosal bone, those extra bones get pulled up into the middle ear embryologically. That's been known since the 1830s. Guess how many creationists and anti-evolutionists ever mentioned that? Zero. Even ones who had to have known about it because it was immaterial that they mentioned. So what happened then, by the late 1890s, they had been finding these odd reptile-y things, these synapsids that had just this single skull opening and had this really big dentary bone. And they were kind of looking like more what you see in the earliest mammals that they could see in the fossil record. And so I called attention in the book to Robert Broom, who is much more famously known for working on Australopithecines on our human evolution line in Africa in the 1920s. He came from South Africa down there, by the way. And he had a really prickly personality, and I mentioned all the little fussbot things. He's kind of a theistic evolutionist and interesting character. Didn't like Darwinism, didn't like Lamarckianism. But when he was looking at how to get from a reptile to a mammal, he said, you know, oh, hey, I have small squamosal Hassan fat incorporated. Ah, yes, indeed. All of these funny little terms that we have to pop up with. But if you talk technical, you have to talk technical. And Broom was looking at what you needed to do to have a mammal and what you could see in these early synapsids and said, you know, how can you get from one to another in an evolutionary way? It has to be natural. It has to be completely gradual. And it has to be functional all the time. Remember what I said earlier about why there's no full half-formed. Everything has to be fully formed and functional in biology to work. And that's why that's a canard that the creationists have. So he looked at these things and he said, you know, this is what you got to do. You got to have the dentary bone warp around and form an end that's right next to where the articular bone is. And then you got to have the skull warp around so that the squamosal bone and the quadrate are next to each other. And a new muscle attachment has to form connecting the squamosal with the dentary bone while the old articular quadrate's still running. Now you got a double jaw animal. And gradually then the double jaw, the dominant one, can be taken over by the squamosal connection, and that frees up this other one to be migrating eventually and pulled up into the middle ear. And he says that's the only way it'll work from an evolutionary point of view. It has to have that way. Well, 20 years later, when they started digging up these double-jawed animals, Diarthognathus was named in his honor, and the Probanognathids were doing the same thing. And we see that process of the formation of the squamosal dentary connection, and then gradually the marginalization of the articular quadrate, and the pulling up into the middle ear, and the retention of the cartilages that connect them. Every possible transition stage that you would need is actually literally preserved in the fossils. And guess how much of that gets discussed in the creationist anti-evolution literature or in intelligent design? Oh, virtually none. They may mention a paper or two, but they don't discuss any of its content. And I go into that in gruesome detail in Evolution Slam Dunk. Paranorm says, RJ, each time you say squamosal, let me see if I can spell it. Squamosal. Yeah, there we go. I hear the LNS theme song now. Yeah, it's all that damn Latin and Greek crap that they use to describe stuff. And what the hell can you do? But those are the terminologies that are used. And if you're going to get into the heavy-duty evolution defense stuff, you're going to have to know about some of that stuff. But everybody, we carry our stuff around with us. Every creationist that shoots their mouth off about how there's no transitional forms in the fossil record is using the physical evidence in their mouth and in their ears that we can literally trace in the fossil record and that every single one of their side ignores. It's just hilarious. Yeah, the squamosal bone, it's the fact that it involved that skull morphing. It's not merely that the attachments had to form. And by the way, I even mentioned the fact that it took me a long time to find it. But there's actually two different ways that a new muscle attachment can form in the old synapsid skull. One of them connects up from another zone of the squamosal, and another one can form up a series of tendons that is the one that eventually ends up being used in these probanognathids and the ones that lead off to regular mammals. And there is another therapsid group that apparently use the other way it developed a different attachment, but that did the same function. So you can see that all of this stuff was doing fully formed. They went off in a bunch of different lineages. Remember, we're talking 100 million years here. It's an awful lot of time going on all of this. And the one thing I regret, and Christine Janis said, you should have pictures. And I said, yeah, I would have loved to have done pictures, but I needed the money. I needed to get the book out in a hurry, and I didn't have time to track down all the rights to all the damn stuff. So if anybody knows an agent or a publisher that wants to take this thing on, please let them know. I am angling to do a second edition of the book where we would do a revised. There's new information that's come along just since the book came out in 2016 that would be added into that. And also I would want to get all the illustrations so that this would be a really heavy brick to be able to knock on to every anti-evolutionist. Let me go back here and see where we are on the Hayev says it's kind of like how they talk about how it would be so hard for life to evolve from sea to land, and yet there are living organisms that show just about every step even today. Yeah, it's true for that. Fino mentions eye development. It's the same thing. That we've got all the transitional stages exist in nature, so we don't have to guess at that. In the stage to land in particular, there's been an enormous amount of work on the development of lungs and cardiovascular system and adaptations. You have to deal with adaptations to fresh water rather than salt and a whole bunch of things. And there's a huge amount of paleontology there. I allude to a little bit of it along the way in Slam Dunk. Another thing that we can remember about lungs is that the teleost fish that are forming during the Cretaceous period, and are most of the fish species we know today, especially the ones that we eat for dinner, those have a swim bladder. And that swim bladder is the evolutionary descendant of the same systems that in the Rhipidistan fishes are eventually forming lungs that form full-blown air breathing. And you can see the dynamics going on in the genetics and in the developmental biology, and there's a mounting technical literature on that point, which again, anti-evolutionists pay no attention to whatsoever. The neat thing about investigating stuff, and I'll say this to our creationist fellow, or I hope he's still in the mix, is you can learn a heck of a lot by tracking down the sources or the issues that are brought up by creationists. I've learned a lot about stuff following up on what the creationist didn't do as research, or the intelligent designer. Dustin, yes, you're saying, since Darwin theorized evolution is spurred on by survival of the fittest and all life evolved from single-cell life, why do you hypothesize that we still have single-cell organisms today? Well, that's, again, that illustration from the diatoms perfectly illustrates it. That you've got the idea that because a new form of life fissions from an old, that the old one disappears, is not true. Just in your own genealogy, Dustin, did all of your cousins drop dead when you were born? Did all of your distant relatives immediately disappear just because you came on the scene? No. And yet you have a lineage relationship to them, and a relationship that can be traced back directly. First of all, bacteria we know are really conservative. The way they have systems, they can borrow information through lateral gene transfer like mad, and they break down all of the notions that we have about what makes a species in a vertebrate context, what kinds are, if you want to look at it from a creationist context, disintegrate at the bacterial level, where you have huge blocks of organisms that rampantly switch information back and forth and form internal variants at enormous speed. At the same time, the overall structure of the bacteria remains really static and conservative. And it's a really successful model. Remember, there are more bacterial cells on and in you than there are you cells. That's how successful bacteria are. There's no reason why such a thing should disappear. The interesting question is not why are there still bacteria, but how come some forms of bacteria ended up as things that are now called multicellular organisms? And there I will put up a word, endosymbiosis, that everybody needs to be familiar with. And the classic case are mitochondria. To this day, we have inside of every cell of our body, all complex organisms have mitochondria. And those are the remnants of a bacterium that didn't quite get digested, and it stayed put inside of another bacterial system, and it retains its own DNA. That's how you can do mitochondrial analysis, because they do its own separate thing. In varying organisms, the mitochondria switches functions back and forth and trims its genome down because it doesn't need certain cell systems because the host cell still has them. And it also keeps its little mitts on our cell death system. So multicellular organisms that produce proliferating cells depend on the mitochondria to say stop that or start that in a lot of functions. And it's a very intricate relationship. And by the way, no creationist does work in that field, period. They're all interlopers from a side bit. The idea didn't originate with Lynn Margulis, but she certainly helped popularize it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And not only are mitochondria endosymbiotic systems, but so too are chloroplasts in the plant cells. Those are literally cyanobacteria. And everybody but anti-evolutionists accept this. The literature on this is just standard. And that's a fascinating subject to look at, not only what the physical evidence is for endosymbiosis, and we have examples of endosymbiotic processes happening today, where living bacterial systems are becoming incorporated as organelles in other bacterial systems. And that's also information that creationists don't pay any attention to. So every possible imaginative component of this stuff are known. The interesting thing is peeling back to look at what was going on literally billions of years ago, where not all of the systems involved would be identical to the ones that we're looking at today, just similar. So it makes it a challenging project. So let me look through and see what we've had in there. Paranorm says exactly why climate change is being tied to a new extinction level event, because the biosphere is changing very fast, too fast for most species to survive. Also a good point. Hayev says evolution loves to find niches where life can exist, and once it does, you'll always find species that exist in those niches, even other life forms involved. That's very good point, Hayev. It's a thing I refer to as extinction pulses in TIP. And I didn't invent the notion, it's around otherwise. But when you look at a mass extinction event, you've got a whole series of organisms doing their shtick. And then usually it's volcanic eruptions destabilizing the system. 3 of the 5 mass extinctions are correlated to that. If you look up TIP 1.2 at TIP, you've got a whole thing on mass extinction issues, and I got a pile of technical literature that follow in that, not only the KT, but all these other ones. So more stuff to look at. Anyway, things filter through and break down the ecosystem, and what was existing before that made it through the Gulf now kind of has the place all to themselves. And it takes typically millions of years, sometimes tens of millions of years, for the bathtub to refill, to where the range of diversity that you found before the extinction gets refilled by the descendants of the things that survived the mass extinction. And so now you can trace those lineages in the development of new forms. And I refer to that as an extinction pulse, where if it were designed, why would the designer take so long to come up with things to refill the bathtub? And why did the system fall down, go boom to begin with? And everybody in the anti-evolution, well, the young Earth creationists think everything all took place in the flood, so they're trying to ramrod all that. But the intelligent designers accept the chronology, so they really don't think about what it means for a designed theme park to fall apart periodically, and then the weird selectivity of what refills the theme park, because they don't pay attention to much of the data. Let's see what else we've got down in here. Oh, Beej says, I'm betting, BJ, I'm betting tardigrades haven't changed much over time, haven't needed to. They have a sparse fossil record. I think they do date back to the Cambrian. And yeah, they don't change a hell of a lot. They're extremely durable. You can freeze them in a block of ice and they'll live for a long time. They can apparently survive without an atmosphere. So theoretically, you can imagine some tardigrade being able to be a panspermia tool, but I don't think that's very likely. But nonetheless, boy, are tardigrades durable. And if you've ever seen a picture of the little water bears, if they were the size of a bear, they'd scare the shit out of you. These weird pudgy little creature with this nozzle mouth, you know, coming at you. Woo! But they're an amazing little critter. All those little weird phyla, because they're small and don't have soft parts, most of them don't have a fossil record at all. And so all the analysis of their evolutionary relationships has to basically go on retroengineering and looking through the gene pool to find out how their genes are constructed and work things out that way. But there's been ongoing work on that subject, and it's more stuff for creationists not to pay attention to. Dustin, another question. Which theory is prevailing for how dinosaurs went extinct, but other lizards, fowls, mammals, amphibians, and plants survived? Again, I covered a lot of the technical literature discussing that in tip 1.2. And the overall point is that although you did have a kind of nuclear winter kind of environment. But the things that tend to survive tend to be ones that have a broad geographical range rather than a selective one. They tend to be much more generalists. They can tend to be able to hibernate. A lot of seed plants and things can survive a huge amount of time before they have to germinate. And it's one of the reasons why a little bit of catastrophe is kind of helpful. Look at the whole debate over forest fires, that it's realized that an awful lot of what does a natural forest system in our modern conifer environment depends on the fact that we've got high oxygen levels and that they're used to fires. And when you suppress fires because it ruins the tourists and burns people's houses, you end up making an unnatural forest that now gets choked out with undergrowth, and it's not healthy, and it's more susceptible to diseases, and a whole bunch of things happen, ironically. So in some respects, you can argue that the kinds of things that made it through the system were ones that were pretty resilient to begin with. The fact that frogs went through so effectively, the fact that an awful lot of reptiles and crocodiles and others made it through, although the forms of life that we have now is relatively limited compared to what was going on then. It doesn't mean that they didn't lose a lot of members, but they survived. The interesting question then is why the dinosaurs, other than the birds, went extinct completely. Why didn't one or two little itty-bitty feathered theropods manage to manage the cut? And that's a fascinating question that we don't have enough data stream yet to resolve. My bet is that all the ones that couldn't fly died out. That flight was an absolutely vital characteristic to the survival of birds, the ability to go up above and treat dimensionally, find a refuge that you couldn't get to and your predator can't get to you. So it doesn't matter how vulnerable your damn egg is, if you're in a spot that no predator can get to because they can't fly. And if bats predated the KT extinction, that would also be a reason for their survival because they could fly. The ecological considerations here, and by the way, any young Earth creationist has to deal with all of that ecological data. Why is it that we can make detailed analyses of how different ecosystems and biogeographical relationships of organisms before an extinction and after an extinction, if all of this is crunched into one gigantic thing? Remember, theoretically, dinosaurs and dimetrodons and rhipidestian fishes and trilobites and human beings and australopithecines all lived at the same time, according to young Earth creationists, all only 4,500 years ago at the time of the flood. And then you have to ask, why were certain animals preferentially not surviving? Why is it that there aren't any therapsids? The ark was supposed to preserve everything. So all of these are terrible problems for that. Anyway, let me follow down through here. Fino says, probably a number of continuously worst events taking place of their food base, volcanic activity, the famous meteorite impact, climate change is influenced by both. Yeah, as I noted in tip 1.2 on mass extinctions, we know that, in fact, although the asteroid impact at Chicxulub took place, and it was disastrous, it was just one bad thing on an already destabilizing ecosystem. The Deccan traps had been going off in India. Just imagine Hawaiian Island volcanic material going off, except 1,000 of them, and going on for like 1,000,000 years. That's what happens when you have one of these big mega plumes. It's like a multiple events of Yellowstone on a bad day. And it was destabilizing the sea system first. Concentrations of sulfuric gases and various other stuff were breaking down the life cycle in the oceans. And that's why an awful lot of things were going extinct way before you get to the breakdown in the land-based systems, some of which were dependent on them because of birds coming in and other animals that were eating things that they came from an ecosystem from down below. So it's a fascinating ongoing project to try to work out 60 million years, 65 million years after the fact, what the crime scene was and how long that crime scene had been building. But the general issue would be that the idea that it was just a big super duper obliterator is too simplistic. That some ecosystems and some connections are much more resilient than others. One of the groups that manages almost invariably to make it through mass extinctions are insects. And I think the Permian mass extinction is the only time that the insects got hit seriously. They just go through a mass extinction like nobody's business. And so anything that eats insects has a bit of an advantage. And it's no coincidence that an awful lot of mammals were insectivores. They were really good at eating bugs. And that may have been something to relate to the plant-eating bunch. A lot of angiosperms made it through. Other kinds of things didn't. So anyway, there's a big, long discussion on that one. And needless to say, is ongoing. And needless to say, anti-evolutionists don't think much about it. Creationists don't write much on it other than to try to go harumph, it's all the flood. And intelligent designers think zero on it. The entire Mesozoic is just a non-subject for them, other than once in a while they may bump into a dinosaur in relation to birds. The dull idiot. Mosasaur tasted like chicken, I hear. Well, mosasaurs would be, they taste a little like snakes. Those are the marine reptiles. They were kind of snaky-like things. I think they had front flippers, and I don't know whether or not they had hind legs or not. I'm trying to remember what a mosasaur looked like. I think they had small ones. So they were kind of like a seal swimmer, and a bit like pliosaurs. That were the ones that also relate to your plesiosaurs, that are your classic hypothetical Loch Ness Monster type, you know, with flipperies like this way, turtle type swimmers. There's a kind of couple different ways that you can swim. You can swim by undulating you can flap with flippers, which are modified limbs, by arching the body and using a tail fluke. And you get the mammal form, which naturally does this, versus your fish and reptiles that naturally do that. So your ichthyosaurs had a different dynamic, although they end up looking hydrodynamically an awful lot like dolphins. More side issues on applied biology. Let's see. The insects are so damn varied and numerous, you'd have to blow up the planet to kill them. Yep. The insects are remarkably imperturbable. They have a great durability. They're very simple, not terribly bright. Although I fear some of the insects are actually brighter than some of the people in political office, but that's another matter. Paranoid says the horseshoe crabs are their descendants they're actually chelicerates. They're in the group with spiders and scorpions. And horseshoe crabs are one of the classic living fossil, although the horseshoe crabs that existed years and years ago in the Devonian and all that aren't the same genus even as the ones that exist now. There's not a single living fossil that's the same species. Coelacanths are the same way. They're not the same species. Latimeria isn't the same species as what existed back in the dinosaur times. They look a lot alike. Why? Because living fossils tend to be generalists. They're relatively predator-free. They live in environments where they are pretty well immune from a lot of major attacks. They eat practically anything. So if you look at most generalist species, those are the ones you'll tend to find on that. Hyper-specialist species come and go. Saber-tooth carnivores pop in and out of the fossil record, both on marsupial sides and placental sides, and they are totally at the dependence of their prey. And if the prey goes extinct, boop, they're gone, because they're too heavily dependent on them. So that's why a lot of living fossils popped up. Yeah, H. mentions horseshoe crabs have weird blood. There's an awful lot of fascinating biology about that stuff. Again, most of which you won't find out from anti-evolution literature, because for people who marvel at the works of the creator, they seem remarkably disinterested other than as a glee club, so they don't tend to do work in the field in that. Pheno says the same as with their velociraptors that actually were the size of Deinonychus. That's a little bit of a story on that, Pheno. Why the velociraptors in Jurassic Park are called velociraptors, and it's all due to who wrote the book. Michael Crichton, if you read the book, had drawn on oh yipes, I've just suddenly forgot his name. Gregory Paul, who had done a book on reclassifying all of the theropod dinosaurs. And he recommended calling what are the Deinonychids, he preferred to call them velociraptors. And Crichton, credulous git, simply adopted his nomenclature. Well, it hasn't settled in the sciences. Velociraptor technically is a little itty-bitty critter, much smaller than what you saw in the movie, that lived in China, and Mongolia, and all the rest. And there, of course, were a variety of ones in that family. There's some Utah raptors way bigger than Deinonychus. But the animal you're seeing in the Jurassic Park movies is Deinonychus. And that's the critter that got Ostrom thinking in the 1960s about bird connections because it had so many bird-like features. And that launched all of that. But I have no problem with calling them velociraptors. It's okay. I can live with that. But I will point out anal retentively that technically they're Deinonychids. Yeah, idiot. Thanksgiving is coming up. We're going to be hungry for eating our dinosaurs. Hayev says Crichton is a bit of a crank. Well, he's now a dead one. But it is true that as many authors do in their old age, and I hope not to get into that category, I'm old but not cranky, is that he got to be a doubter of climate change. And it was one of those where you get yourself into a frame where you just accept just a limited data set and you can't imagine you were wrong. Earl Stanley Gardner, the guy that created Perry Mason, did the same shtick with the dinosaur sculptures. I mentioned that in Slam Dunk. And Arthur Conan Doyle with his infamous defense of the fairy pictures in the 1920s. Fino says he also read Andromeda Strain in Congo. Congo was not terribly good. Andromeda Strain is one of my favorite science fiction films. I think that one is absolutely delicious. Robert Wise, who directed Day the Earth Stood Still and Star Trek the Motion Picture and Sound of Music and West Side Story, all of those things, did Andromeda Strain, and it is deliciously clever. It reflects an awful lot of the scientific method. It's my favorite Michael Crichton story. I'd much rather watch Andromeda Strain than Jurassic Park because it's about a group of scientists trying to resolve a deadly problem and trying the best they can based on limited information. And at one point, I won't be a spoiler alert, but they make a decision that in retrospect turns out to be potentially disastrous. And you can realize why they made the mistake at the time, and then they have to figure out how to correct it. And that really reflects a lot of what science does. And plus, it's got a rip-snortingly good cast. David Wayne and I can't think of the name of the actress that played. There was originally a male that was intended for the role, but they put the woman in instead, the one that has the epilepsy. And so there's an awful lot about it, and it's all hyper-realistic. The technology that's being shown from the gas chromatographs and all of the electron microscopes is real gear that was used for the movie. And it's hilarious to see how primitive the computers are, but the kind of interactive medical comms that they're talking about in the story that are super cutting edge in 1970 is ultimately what turned out to be the case. And we use that all the time now. Well, we just have better technology on it. Yeah, the first name is Michael. Yeah, Michael Crichton. Yeah, I haven't paid too much Paranorm to his writing per se. Okay. Oh, heck, we've just shot past our hour. I'm sorry, I did it on too long. It's 6:10. I think I've covered as much as I could on this shorthand view. The speciation literature is huge. Anybody who is a masochist can theoretically download my reference bibliography and just put in the word search speciation. And you'll find a whole slew of stuff, critics of speciation. You'll find incipient speciation papers, and there's just a lot of stuff on it. And I don't claim to have a grip on all of the material, but I do claim to have at least a good oar in the water. And I can see from this vantage that anti-evolutionists are just terrible at this. And for the conceptual reasons that I explained, I hope I've clarified this a bit. I've given you some openings on things. I hope I've answered Dustin's questions. Or at least prodded him to investigate farther. All the papers that are then are open access links. People can download those and read away and start their own study. Oh, Paranorm says you don't mind extended RJ. Fino asked Dustin, are you happy with what you've heard, or do you have any urgent questions left? Yeah, by all means, yes. Give us any feedback and or parting shot questions, and I can continue on because, you know, it's free. We can continue on a little bit longer if we've got some cutting edge stuff on there. It's a really critical issue, speciation and how you apply it to stuff. It applies to creationist kinds. Ironically, creationists, I pointed this out in other contexts, but it's still true. Creationists simultaneously say there's only created kinds, and they have a problem that they've got to stuff them onto the ark, and then they have to accommodate why there are millions of species now. So they have to figure out what happened to all of those things afterwards. And they end up requiring unbelievably rapid speciation. Leitner Judith, I think her name is, or Susan Leitner, I think, a young Earth creationist. She did a thing where she figured, I think, like 196 kinds of birds, of which the finch are one kind. Well, that's 1,200 species, including every one of the Galapagos finches. So she thinks that all of the finches of the world proliferated from one finch kind in only 4,500 years, and in fact less, because a lot of these things didn't just pop up at the time Darwin arrived. So that is biologically impossible. Creationists are requiring a rate of speciation that's ridiculous, and they've never offered evidence that speciation can take place that fast in the way they need to get the variety of species that you can see and their genetic haplotypes, which they don't pay any attention to. So am I impressed with how creationists deal with speciation and kinds? Nope. And I'm perfectly happy to say why. Does it keep hangouts to their scheduled durations is quaint oddballhood on YouTube. I'm finding out that. Hayev says, many creationists seem to think that speciation means dogs giving birth to cats, even though if that happened, there would actually be evidence against evolution. Absolutely. And remember, the examples that are used, including stuff and answers in Genesis, is exactly that moronic. It's, well, look at all the dog breeds, and they're just still dogs. Yeah, they're within the particular species, but how do you deal with the Miacids, the ancestors to the cats and dogs? Oh, gosh, they don't discuss them. So what it involves is they leave the data out. Another one, of course, is the infamous crocoduck that Kurt, what's his name, came up with, Kurt Cameron, where basically somebody photoshopped a duck head on the back, no, a crocodile head on the front end of a duck. And that's supposedly, because there are no crocoducks, that disproves evolution. And if I ever bump into him, I want to ask him, or any creationist, if you bump into anybody that uses that argument, ask what paleontologist came up with that idea as a transitional form? And the answer is none, because no paleontologist would be so phenomenally stupid to suggest that. That is exactly what you wouldn't see in a transitional form, because you've got crocodiles are highly derived archosaurs that don't have the skull structures of a bird form. And the duck body is a derived bird form that's got no tail, it's got a pygostyle and all the rest. It has exactly what you wouldn't expect a transitional to look like, and no evolutionist has ever offered anything even remotely like a crocoduck. What you did find were propositions that early birds, proto-birds, would be bipedal animals that had feathered wings, long tail, and teeth, like a reptile. And that's exactly what Archaeopteryx has. That's exactly what all of these feathered theropods and all of that have. And we've indeed worked out even more level. Paranorm asks, RJ, no, you have to ask, did he get you to put that banana up your butt? Now, let's not be nasty. Just because Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron run amok in the land of stupid. They are, by the way, the bottom feeders in creationism. No one can ever accuse Kirk Cameron or Ray Comfort or the people that they rely on of ever reading anything close to the upper level of creationism. Your baraminologist, your Jeffrey Tompkins. So ironically, I read more creationist material at the technical level. Answers in Genesis has a technical journal, a research journal. And I pay close attention to that. I have a huge block of that stuff in my #tip data set because that's their upper tier. But the people at Kirk Cameron land, they're not anywhere near that. It's highly unlikely any of them have ever read anything more than just an occasional book on the subject or listened to a video. And so it's all basically folk creationism that runs off the rails at any it runs off the rails at any count. Hayev says Ray Comfort's idea of research is talking to random people on the street. Yeah, that's part of his bit. It's the gotcha approach, or for that matter, interviewing people. He did the same gotcha thing, I think, with Richard Dawkins, or certainly did it with P.C. Myers, where what you do is you interview them on a subject and then you data parse and quote mine stuff that when you rearrange it makes it fit what their apologetics is. So the idea of having a genuine conversation on a technical subject and kind of clarifying things to understand one another, nope, that's not what he's doing. Anybody that you can go through any one of his apologetic videos if you feel like it and look for information content, which is usually zero, literally. It's all just apologetics and finding some doofuses on the street that will say some stupid thing and show that they don't understand evolution. Well, yeah, too bad. But the data is still there. And the moment at which you ignore the data, you're not playing on the game field. And Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron don't know diddly squat of the data field. At least somebody like a Jeffrey Tompkins or an Andrew Snelling are operating on the data field. They screw everything up, but at least they're at that level. Fino says, just look at this Genesis Apologetics Ministry with the amateur acting C videos on creationism. They use the arguments the likes of CC of Coin, but are bad at. Yeah, and a lot like Eric Hovind, a pale imitation of his dad's heyday. Well, he does better graphics. Eric Hovind is an amiable-looking guy. He's very telegenic, whereas Daddy Kent looks like somebody who just got off the Mormon train out in Provo and is about ready to convert the heathen. So he has a kind of grizzled quality to him that you don't get with the son. Hovind the Younger is merely repeating the tropes that he got from other creationists. And when you look at the various claims that he makes, that's pretty clear. Sometimes you can track down what he doesn't realize he's relying on. And that is very much like his dad, because Hovind Sr. Hasn't had an original thought in his life. He's taken all of his material, secondarily, from anti-evolutionists that he's read, largely stuff that dates back quite a ways, and some of it's internet-y stuff. He still pushes Karl Boz, Paluxy Tracks, and all that stuff, which is basically lower-level creationism. And but make no mistake about it, they have a huge following. There are millions of people around the country who swear by the scientist Kent Hovind. I bump into them all the time, locally and on the internet. So never for a moment confuse their stupidity and incompetence for lack of popularity or influence, because they're there. Some of the people in the Dover case in 2005 were relying on Kent Hovind videos. You find people to this day trotting out chick pamphlets that were based on Kent Hovind arguments. And this circulates all the time. So it's one of the reasons why it's a never-ending battle of whack-a-mole, but I think is not an inappropriate one. Everybody who follows me on Twitter theoretically should be able to observe how my hashtag tip methods works against them. And insult they can take, being called a believer in silly religions, they can easily deflect that. But try asking them how they check their sources, and it goes silent. That was the question I asked Matt Huffman in the debate. I think his name Matt Huffman. Huffman's last name. I finally got around to being able to ask him that question, and he just went into deer in the headlight mode. Like, whoa. And it was my favorite moment because it was exactly what I was expecting. And I wished I could have started off with that and put him into deer in the headlight mode and save an hour of trying to bandy back and forth on subject matter that was too contrived. That's one of the reasons why fixed subject matter debates can be awfully awkward. Ah, yes. The Fino says, yes, it was the doctorate. He's probably perfectly competent within his field. He's an anesthesiologist, but he's a young earth creationist. And it was obvious all his research consisted of was reading some creationist and believing what they said. And it literally never occurred to him to fact check. Now, I fact check everybody. I'm fact checking the evolutionists that I'm reading. If I read a Richard Dawkins book, one of the reasons why I was kind of disappointed with Bill Nye's book on the subject is because it doesn't have any references. And it's pretty slim. There was nothing new in it that I didn't already know. An awful lot of Richard Dawkins falls into that category. Boy, you have to plow through a lot of Dawkins to bump into something that I wasn't already aware of. So I really didn't pay a heck of a lot of attention to it. But still, you can measure the accuracy or not of his positions based upon whether or not he offers documentation and whether or not you can do follow-up work. That's the scholarly methods tool at work. It's a universal toolkit. So anyway, Hayab says, Ray's latest one is Exit the Appeal of Suicide. Is there an appeal to suicide, which is just an attempt to make money off mental problems? I bumped into that with a couple creationists who may have been the same creationists, were some uncertain as to whether or not it was a troll account. I don't typically get annoyed to the point of blocking or reporting people, but I'd happened to mention about my dad had died before I was born, and one of my little brothers died rather sadly when I was too young to remember it, but it affected the family and my mother a lot. And this one creationist had the temerity to try to make hay off of that and said that I hated God. It was clear that I hated God because I blamed him for the death of my dad and my brother. And that's just false. I didn't blame God for that. How can I blame a non-existent entity? I don't blame the Easter Bunny. I don't blame Santa Claus. I don't blame Vishnu or the Flying Spaghetti Monster either. And neither did Mom. She never once gave that kind of a connection. So he was literally bearing false witness to try to do that. But he was trying to pry loose an apologetic evangelical edge on that. And he crossed over into turf, even to the point one of them put up the picture of the headstone that was on my brother's grave. So I'm assuming either he trolled something where some of our family members had posted it online, or he lives in Spokane and is a stalker. But in any case, that pissed me off. And I reported him on that and said, nope, I won't go with that. And then Zane, just a couple days later, he's an idiot. You can see the comments that I had with him at TIP. I was glad that he came over to my website and actually posted stuff because he can't delete any of that. I have control over that. So everybody gets to read it forever. Anyway, he accused me of being a communist. And I go, excuse me, no, that's false. It's ridiculously false. I'm not even a Marxist. I'm not even a socialist. I'm not a Bernie Sanders supporter. So there. So I voted for Ronald Reagan. Thank you very much. And Obama. And for the same reasons. And I would be happy to explain all of that to anybody who bothered to ask. But Zany never got to that point. Instead, as far as I can tell, he's a superficial, low-level creationist, hyper-conservative Trump supporter, what I describe as Kulturkampf. And he had all the earmarks of it. And plus being an annoying jerk and humorless and snotty. And so finally, when he got to that communist thing, I said, no, that's too much. I say goodbye on that. Hi, I says, didn't you know all atheists are communists? Didn't McCarthy teach you anything? Yeah. I am old enough to remember all of that framework. And I always kind of feel awkward because if I'm in a room full of culture campers, I feel like Che Guevara. But if I'm in a room full of leftists, the kinds that are wobbly, international worker of the world, black fists raised, I feel like Milton Friedman. So my political and economic views haven't altered one iota, but the frame matters. And one of the things that worries me, here I'll go off onto a political thing, even though we're a half hour past the thing. So we're in kind of a default after show. The important thing about that worries me about the current political environment and the fact that we've got so many Tortukans running around in political office that's dangerous is that it's forcing us to take sides we shouldn't have to take. Is the choice really between Donald Trump and Antifa? Oh, I hope not. The great middle needs to be able to be reconstituted. And these wackaloon extremists that are basing their viewpoints on bad method and ideological misrepresentation of source material and demonization of their opponents, they've got to be pushed off of the public realm. And we've got a couple chances to do this in the various elections that are coming up. There's going to be a big one in 2018 if we don't have more voter turnout, if people of reason and evidence don't get off their duffs, if young millennials in college and other places don't get off their duffs and register to vote and make sure they vote in their local elections and in the larger elections and make their voices known, excuse me, then it's our fault that things have gotten into such a disarray. And it looks way too similar to the 1920s, which was a period of overly exuberant economic confidence and not realizing problems that were over the horizon. And then when that collapsed in 1929, that's when these extreme fascists, and for that matter, the communism that had come up in the Soviet Union, became the default this or that. And eventually it led to the Second World War and tens of millions of people dying under circumstances that we would definitely regret. And you want to nip that in the bud. That's what it involves, being reasonable. You want to prevent those stupid things from happening. If there had never been an economic collapse, you never would have had a Hitler. You wouldn't have had a Second World War. If you had never had a circumstance where a Mussolini ever got into power. But we have Trump, we have Putin, we have Erdogan, in addition to Un over in North Korea. And there are too many places in the world where individual conscience and reason and evidential reasoning and respect for free presses and all the rest are just being trampled. And we can't tolerate that as a civilization. not with nuclear weapons and the things that are facing us as dangers. And to the extent that I'm a voice for that sort of thing, and other people could be voices for not going to the brink and jumping off like lemmings, I'm going to keep at it as long as I can. Duh, idiot. This section of the hangout is going to get you triple secret, quadruple demonetized, RJ. Yeah, demonetization is what I fear is always my fate, which is why people can go to the GoFundMe or Patreon, and it won't matter what happens on YouTube. They can put their voice in directly. Let me be blunt and do a shameless plug again. Crowdsourcing could do it, damn it. We've got more than enough people. The point is, we're terrible at this sort of thing as a group. We're like herding cats, and thousands of people. I've got 1,900 people following me on Twitter, but I don't have 1,900 supporters at GoFundMe. I don't even have 190. And so it isn't as though the people aren't there. Many of people have huge followings theoretically, but it doesn't do anything. It can't connect up apparently. Whereas the culture camp people that are currently running the government network beautifully. They, Tony Perkins and the Family Research Council and Breitbart. I'll repeat this lesson that has stuck with me. When I was just setting up my GoFundMe account, it took quite a long while, and around the same time, in Mike Pence's Indiana, while he was still governor, there was a complaint about the new possibility that there would be gay marriage. And apparently some pizza parlor were terribly pushed out at the prospect that they would have to cater gay weddings or do something like that. And on their own initiative, Breitbart set up a GoFundMe account for them. And in 2 days, $300,000 came in from 20-some-odd thousand people. 2 days. Boop. That shows you how effectively they are in their network. No lawsuits were occurring. It was eventually shut down because it violated some of the rules, but nevertheless, they got a ton of money that way. Individually, their donations were probably only about, I think I've calculated it at $27 per donator, which is a third of the very wonderful people that have donated to TIP so far. And I average about $84 from the donators, but I've only got 151 people in 3-4 years of it. So I'm in the drip mode. Everybody there, some people can only spare a tiny bit. That's wonderful. I mean, I never want anybody to get into financial trouble or whatever on my account. But if they've got money that they might have spent on a latte that they could toss at TIP, that's something to consider. And plus, I got books. 2 books out now, Slam Dunk, and then the novel Phileas Fogg. I'm quite, if you want some light, wonderful reading to take you away from the troubles of 2017, Journey to 1872 with Phileas Fogg. Well, we're at 6:30. We've gone into a slight overshot here, and I don't want to make this into a long extended plug for my GoFundMe account, even though I wouldn't have a problem with that. But nevertheless, that's really not what I was into on the Evolution Hour. I think hopefully people will look up the sources that I link to, will do their own research. There's a lot of stuff on it. They shouldn't be surprised that it's difficult to find speciation events in the fossil record for a reason that Benton explains beautifully in his argument and in his article, and that hasn't changed any. And yes, I would like to thank everybody that's been watching the show, and some will be watching later. Another reader question on Twitter will be the thing for next week. Evolution 22 will be on recent human evolution issues and also the deep primate roots of humans. And I'll try to figure out all the stuff there. Those were questions that were brought up by a different questioner, a non-creationist. And I like the idea that whenever possible, I can be doing shows that are directly reflecting what pops up on Twitter. And remember, pick my brain on Twitter and pick my brain at TIP. If you have any question about a subject, if you're curious about something, I know Pelagia has used my resource to fact check things, and he asked me directly on Twitter. We have exchanges where he's looking up on a particular point, and I'll tell him what I've done in my research and kind of save him some of the steps on it and give him links that he can follow and all of that. And everybody can do that. On Twitter, I'm at RJ Downard. I'll put that up. I answer all, and unless people start complaining about my dead brother and making a nuisance of themselves, I won't be blocking you. And then also the main website at TIP, where anybody can go and put up questions, and I check that daily. There's not only the main sections, but there's comment spots in every one of the things, the main page and the old tip and the new module section and other stuff and the contact part, any one of those. I look through all of those. And I recognize I'm still a work in progress on the TIP website. I still need to revamp that. I'm still a novice at this. I need to get a search engine. I'm probably going to have to reformat the files into an HTML system and that I can then update myself, and all of that is more work to do. And in the meantime, I'm trying to figure out how to pay the bills and keep the internet connection going so that I can continue to do this work. Even if you can't financially support the project, tell people about the project. And anybody that you know of, including people higher up on the food chain, from Jerry Coyne to Richard Dawkins or anybody else, if you want to communicate with them and say, hey, I'm here, you might want to pay attention. It's kind of useful, and it's a new way of looking at things. If I can't do all my drum beating myself, I depend on everybody else to make it a network. And the goal, bigger, is to create a genuine science strike force where, through crowd sourcing of information, every anti-evolutionist anywhere who tries to run for public office or sticks their head up and does a lecture and tries to corrupt science for their ends, somebody locally will be able to respond to them and will be able to draw on the collective knowledge base that all of us together will have constructed through all of our various expertise. We can do it. This is 21st century. Information. Here I am, an old fart from the era of dial telephones, who is on the internet with a video, and I'm able to do that. Idiot says, does the Dawkins Foundation know about you? Not that I know of. I have emailed and tweeted him on various occasions over the years, and it just, boop, it's piss in the wind. So anybody out there who wants to say, listen, you have had an experience with me, if you actually got my books, or the material you've downloaded, or any of those, to where you have been able to look at and say for yourself honestly, I'm doing pretty interesting new work at a level that's not like what anybody else has done before. I'll just put a brief summary of what I'm doing in TIP. I'm trying to create a universal data set that's like talk origins on a big scale. That would be, theoretically, in the long run, it will cover everything. That's what I was starting to do on the modules before I bumped into financial troubles and had to put that on hold so I could do other things. That's why I had to do the slam dunk book. All of that eventually would be part of the TIP project. And I'm also, along the way, measuring things literally no one's ever measured before. How many creationists there are? How many sources are they citing in the technical literature? What proportion of that is the data stream? So in the big long run, I can tell you, I'll type this out so everybody can see it as well, that 95% of all anti-evolutionists do not cite primary sources. That involves about 2,000 anti-evolutionists so far in my data set that have generated some 8,000 anti-evolution works, and it covers virtually every major player on the field. And of the 5% of anti-evolutionists who do cite primary sources, that they're missing 90% of the data stream. And nobody had ever been able to do this before. In those 8,000 sources, they've managed to cite only some 3,000 sources. And a lot of it's dated, a lot of it's used for authority quoting and all the rest. I have a data set of 22,000 technical papers and another 8,000 general science works. And so as a rough heuristic, I don't claim at all to have a complete grip on all the science data. So I'm saying that as a rough heuristic, they're missing 90% of the data. And it was very difficult to get this going because, and I came into it, I stumbled into it inadvertently, because I realized I was constructing these data spreadsheets to manage my data flow and to keep track of what I'd cited and what I hadn't and how many technical papers I had on particular subjects and so forth and so on. And I realized, wait a minute, I can measure something else while I'm doing that. So I've had to switch everything over to what I've been doing. Here, I'll give everybody a little taste with another one of my pathetic. I've done this for some people, but I haven't done it online and that before. So I'll give you a little teaser as to what I'm doing. Switch over to my dreaded screen share again. Come. Doopity boop, boop. There we go. Opening up my, let's make that a big screen. Everybody should be able to see that. Now, there's my master summary. Hopefully people can see that. And maybe I better lower it down like this. Summary sheet for my master sheet, where I'm looking at, here is the anti-evolution worldview. There's 1,166 creationists. They've produced 4,611 sources. That's 56% of the anti-evolution thing. They've got 35 different journals that they've done over the years compared to 10 intelligent design. There's 397 websites that are involved in that compared to 158 that are non-young Earth creationists. And over here is my 22,590 technical works, which I've broken down in a variety of ways. And that I had originally constructed this. That was just a tracking sheet for my chapters. Each one of those columns here reflects what would future be chapters. And for example, I've already cited Wignall and Wignall et al. In the work that I had done so far. I have color bars to indicate whether I have a full text or not, or just an abstract, whether something is a technical paper and if it's been cited, or up here with WeGloss, this is a paper that has been cited by an anti-evolutionist. And that ultimately goes over to this citation file back of all of the different balancings where I've calculated up who all are the creationists. Here are the young Earth creationists who have been technical people, and then others who have cited technical literature. This is the intelligent design side over in here, and then breakdowns according to genetics, biology, speciation, taxonomy, biogeography, paleontology, geology, origin of life, cosmology, human evolution, cognitive psychology, climate change, and then a miscellaneous section, and then sections for ones where the articles are only cited secondarily by some newspaper account or summary paper. And this way I'm literally getting a grip on what's happening in that field in a way that has never been done before, and it allows me to be pugnacious about saying how many anti-evolutionists are trivial in the main field. Those 22,000 technical papers are written by 62,000 scientist authors, and I literally have a spreadsheet that counts all of that as well. So I'm giving a meta-analysis meat to things. Yes, Fino says, RJ, do you mean the 7 kinds of evolution? You use weird names for them. Ha ha ha. Yeah. Yeah, your 7 kinds of stuff, that's typical of Kent Hovind. And he's riffing basically off of Institute for Creation Research and ICR things, where the evolution, they allow microevolution, and then there's cosmic and stellar evolution and natural selection. And they have a whole bunch of little parsings on that. And the general notion of evolution is something that changes naturally, then it's in that context. I always use the term natural branching common descent and force everybody onto that. Duh Idiot says, you're as big a fan of tracking things by color coding as my wife, with this bad an eye for appealing colors. Well, I don't care about how colorful it is. I only want to be able to see it easily. So I keep things to a minimum, and I try to keep categories to a minimum to give a sense of what's going on and to allow me to make sure that I'm in the right columns and so forth and so on. See, once you get the spreadsheet sets up, then all you have to do is to plug the data in, and the calculators will automatically work out what the numbers and percentages are and all that kind of stuff. Fino says that he knows about that. He's seen him quoted it a lot with that bullshit, and it's very common tropes. It's another thing I'm trying to get everybody up to speed on, because I've read so much anti-evolution material. I know where they're coming from a lot, and so some things are kind of buzzwords that you go, aha, I know where they're riffing off of. Other things are more generic anti-evolutionism, and you need to probe to find out what camp they're coming from. And it makes a difference how you approach the problem, whether you're coming at it from a young Earth creationist versus an intelligent design perspective. And you can't always assume right off the bat. This is why you have to ask. But once you do, and gradually get them onto some sort of data stream, then you can figure out which trap doors are available and which anvils you want to drop. HVAC, then you can further separate it by observational and historical science. Yeah, I did a whole section on that in the origins of that concept in tip 1.7. That tip. And by the way, you can also find these things at the modules, at least, in HTML format at a kind of mirror site that was set up by a friend of mine. It said that the PDFs are awkward to get at for people that are on iPhones and that. And I understand that. That's another reason why, as a work in progress, I want to move it up to make it as data friendly as possible. I want to put in visuals. I want to put in video links in a much better way. But I'm still a clunking novice on this. I learn how to do stuff and I figure out what more to do. And once I understand it, then I'm okay. But until I do, I'm like the worst kid you've ever seen trying to ride the bicycle and not working well. Fino says, never cross the moron streams. Oh, but they get crossed a lot. And in fact, an earlier video I did, for those of you who've been following, was on the smorgasbord phenomenon, that the people you're encountering in anti-evolution land, most likely in Twitter and social media, will not be anywhere near the upper echelon data stream fact claimant bunch. These are people who will have heard stuff that they heard at church, or they saw a video somewhere, or they talked to somebody, and it's material that's they've just been troping as part of their cultural stream. And tropes will be repeated. Some of them that are dedicated enough may actually reach the point of reading a book. And you'll get one of those says, have you read a book by Scott Hughes? And I go, yes. Would you like to talk about its various errors? Yes, I already have read that. You know, so I have an advantage that is hard to throw me off because I've read most of the stuff, and so I'm ahead of them. And that's the goal of TIP, is to stay ahead of the game. So I'm always looking at the new incoming technical stream. A lot of the people I've gotten on Twitter, I follow any of the major league creationists. I don't follow any lower echelon people. I encounter them through other people, and I drop anvils on them that way. But I don't follow them because they're not the critical ones. The higher level ones are the ones I follow that are on Twitter. From you, Ross, and Ken Ham to David Klinghoffer and a few others. But I also follow a lot of the scientists. Any of the people that I encounter, their technical work, that I discover they're on Twitter, I'll follow them, because I'm basically sending out spider web tendrils where they're going to be telling me about their latest work in their field and the other interesting work in their field. So I get a heads up that's in relatively obscure networks. I mean, I look at proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Science and Nature every week. That's the top tier. But I've got 1,700 technical journals in the bibliography. I can't follow every one of those. So my spider webs will tripwire the technical papers for me. And I can keep up on incoming technical literature that way, in a way that crosses disciplinary lines. And anything that then relates to material that relates to the TIP project, I can keep track of. So my goal is that is to be ahead of the anti-evolutionists, not behind. And that way, when you, Ross, I've been acting as a selection pressure, I think, for you, Ross, because he used to do a lot of gee whiz stuff on evolution theme issues, and he doesn't do that so much anymore. He steers clear of more on cosmology fronts and kind of non-controversial stuff that anybody would agree with. Maybe because whenever he would put something up earlier, I'd dump a paper link to the evolutionary history of it. And I'm not sure he liked that. And he could have blocked me, but he didn't. And Ross is actually unusual in that he will actually respond to you. And that's unlike the ideologues. Your Ken Hams and Kent Hovians don't respond to anybody. They just pontificate and drop stuff downstream. It's a one-way street for them. So I have to give kudos to a Ross, who does do two-way streets. He gets people of differing views on, and he interviews them, and he has discussions with them. He appears on other contexts where he's able to do that sort of thing. He's not necessarily the most effective person for it. He's kind of a dweeb, and being a dweeb myself, I can tell one when I see one. But at least he has the honesty of that. Hive said, didn't block you. Wow, that's pretty rare. There have been only a few. The ones who tend to block me tend to be lower echelon creationists that I bump into. The ones that do not like it when I ask those terrible questions. Gee, what sources did you use and how did you check them? Uh-oh, they don't like that. And so they'll tend to back off on that front. But I keep track of all these little things. And I said I don't typically block people unless they cross the line on making stuff that's just scurrilous. Stupidity I can handle, but vile, nasty, no. And there I do cross the line. But I would contend, as Dustin was showing here, I mean, he has legitimate questions. I don't know whether he's going to follow up on the material or not, but maybe he will. And there's a heck of a lot of material out there, and everybody can get access to it. It's not locked away in a vault. That's one of the advantages that we have now, and that I have in TIP today that I didn't have just 10 years ago, is that 90% of the material I need is available online, free. And as an impoverished writer, I can't afford to buy stuff. So the more I can get PDFs at no charge, or that if I can get it and copy it into a HTML or a doc file and then save it that way, where I can print up selectively what I need when I have money for ink, which I'm getting low on again, I can do that. But nobody has any excuse nowadays for ignorance of the data. They can only say their mouse hand clawed up when they were trying to click on the technical link. It's because it's their lack of gumption, not the unavailability of the data. Although some journals are ones, Science and Nature, you have to get subscriptions to. But boy, you'd be surprised at the amount of work that's been posted on ResearchGate and Academia EDU, and available on professors' websites where they post their own papers as PDFs. So one way or the other, you can often find material even if at the official website is behind a firewall. And a lot of the main journals, particularly in biological fields, tend to become open access after a certain amount of time, and you can get a lot of the older literature that way. So you have to hunt around, but you can find it. Looking at some more of the things here. Yeah, just Fino says he just saw a video where a woman was so happy about having seen a UROS video as he laid her doubts about evolution creation to rest. So disappointing. Not surprising, though, because it will sound very convincing. And every cockamamie nincompoop down the line sounds convincing. I sound convincing. I don't expect you to take my word on faith. In fact, I strongly recommend you not. Don't assume what I say is true. Test it out. And I'm willing to defend everything that I say and do. And I may go out of my way to offer sources on things. Because that's the way you do things. And I'm not infallible. I just had to check an opinion. I was talking with somebody about Bertrand Russell, and I had relied mistakenly, and I found this out when I looked in my old notes, because I had a little footnote on Russell, and this biography by Monk that was from a regular college press, and his earlier volume on Russell had been well received and so forth, so I went with it. But I hadn't done any follow-up on it. And it turns out he just doesn't like Bertrand Russell, and it was widely excoriated at the time, and I didn't realize that. So I discovered that after the fact and had to do some background research. Unfortunately, I found out that most of Russell's work now is available online, so I was able to download a pile of his books and do some cross-checking on things about his relationships and criticisms of the Soviet Union and his views on eugenics and a few of these other things, so you can look at it in context. And when I get around to doing a revision on the way down in chapter 6, because the Bible tells me so section, I would be making an adjustment on that thing on Russell, that I had based it on Monk's book, and that was a mistake. So I goof, and you learn. And the primary rule is always the devil's in the details. I put all the links you put in the chat in all your vid descriptions, man. I do try to do that, duh, idiot. In fact, on this one, I did have to put links up to my website, and all of the main technical papers that I alluded to in this discussion are up in the description, and you can link to them. And you can get them full text. I try to avoid putting any link up that can only be accessible as an abstract, because you can't do fact-checking that way. You can't do follow-up that way. You got to see the whole text. And so all of those things are available in HTML or PDF format, and you can download them and do the follow-up on there. And if anybody objects to anything I say, ask me for my sources, and I'm happy to do that. Okay, we're at 6:52. Our impromptu after show. I'll definitely want to curtail this at the end of the hour. And any last minute questions, comments? Um, oh, Fino back there. McRae sometimes like philosophy more than truth. Yes, you get into some rather interesting discussions on there where it can go back and forth like a ping pong match. And one of the recent ones that I bumped into was where he was discussing with a fellow on the definition of agnostic and atheist. And both of them saying, oh, we don't want to get bogged down on definitions. And then they proceeded to get bogged down on definitions. And I'm going, oh, I have more time. I can spend more fruitfully on something other than this. Okay, so we are about ready to shut up here for Evolution Hour 21. And I hope I've covered the subject of speciation in a useful way, that I've answered all the relevant questions and made relevant comments on what was happening in the live stream, and summarized what was occurring in the live stream as much as possible. I'm going to keep at this as long as I can. And I hope I'm contributing things that are valuable. And I hope that other people catch the bug about why a methods approach is not only powerful and useful, it's also the only way that you can ground sound reasoning. That you always have to be willing to revise your strongly held beliefs if new evidence comes along, like I did with Monk on Bertrand Russell. And you always want to be curious about what you believe and why. So everybody deals with philosophy, whether they like it or not. It's not that everyone is going to end up with the same viewpoint, but if you're honest about it and you're willing to defend things civilly, that's important. And we got to work towards a society where nobody can ever get killed just because they have the wrong opinion. That's something that's harder. And we have a problem with that as cultures. And those principles, ultimately, if you find people who can confuse a primary and a secondary source, who can mangle and misrepresent stuff, that's the same sort of person that is not a good idea to be a politician or a governor or a president or a leader of any capacity or somebody that can make decisions, because they're going to run off the rails. They're going to make poor decisions because they're applying what is fundamentally a bad method. That's why this boring source analysis stuff isn't boring at all. It's a contact sport. And it's a vital one that we ignore and fail to apply, ultimately to our peril. Okay, there we go. And I am now closing up shop for today.